My husband threw the divorce papers onto the buffet table, announcing I had 36 hours to vacate so his mistress could move in. He boasted about funding her luxury lifestyle, convinced his wallet was the only one she had access to. He did not know my forensic accountant had tracked his spending for 6 months and found a devastating truth. He was not her only financial backer, and worse, he was the poorest client on her roster. My name is Victoria Sterling. I am 40 years old, and after 2 decades as a senior art appraiser, I have developed an instinct for spotting fakes. It is a skill that served me well as I stood in the center of my Hamptons estate, surrounded by the elite of New York society. The evening was intended to be a sophisticated fundraiser for the arts, with crystal flutes chiming and polite conversation drifting over the manicured lawn. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the salty Atlantic breeze. Everything was perfect until the double doors to the terrace were thrown open with a violence that silenced the string quartet. Richard marched in like he was storming a beach. My husband of 10 years looked ridiculous. He is 45. But tonight, he was dressed like a man half his age trying desperately to remain relevant. His suit was too tight, his tan was too orange, and his teeth were bleached a blinding white that looked unnatural under the patio lights. He is the CEO of a tech startup that has been bleeding money for 3 consecutive quarters, yet he strutted toward me with the unearned confidence of a billionaire. He did not greet the guests. He did not apologize for the interruption. Instead, he stopped at the long buffet table laden with caviar and lobster and threw a thick manila envelope right onto the pristine white tablecloth. It slid across the surface, knocking over a flute of champagne before coming to a rest in front of me. Divorce papers. The bold block letters were visible to everyone standing nearby. He raised his voice, ensuring the entire garden could hear him. He told me I had 36 hours to pack my bags and get out of his house. The audacity was breathtaking. Richard looked around at our friends, at my colleagues, and sneered. He publicly humiliated me, calling me a leech. He called me boring, stifling, and uninspired. He announced that he was finally upgrading to a woman who matched his ambition. He spoke the name Sierra with a reverence usually reserved for religious figures. He claimed she was a brilliant businesswoman, a visionary, and that she would be the new mistress of this estate by the weekend. He actually believed he was evicting me from the property my grandfather built, a detail he seemed to have conveniently forgotten in his rage. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg. I simply stood there, smoothing the silk of my dress, and looked at him. I observed him the way I observe a counterfeit Monet. The brushstrokes were sloppy, the signature was forced, and the provenance was a lie. I saw the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. I saw the slight tremor in his hand as he pointed a finger at me. He was performing, acting out a script of masculine dominance he had likely rehearsed in the mirror a dozen times that morning. The silence of the crowd broke into a hum of scandalous whispers. Phones were raised, cameras recording every second of my supposed humiliation. Richard bathed in the attention, mistaking their shock for awe. He puffed out his chest, grinning like a conqueror standing over a defeated city. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the head of my security team step forward, his hand reaching for his radio to call for backup. I made a subtle motion with my hand, a small flick of the wrist. Stand down. I did not want them to stop him. I wanted Richard to climb as high as he possibly could on this mountain of delusion so that his fall would be lethal. I glanced at the watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The timing was impeccable. Just this morning, my forensic accountant had messaged me to say the final dossier was complete. Richard thought this was his moment of triumph. He thought he was discarding an old wife to start a fresh, exciting life with his wealthy new partner. I looked at the manila envelope soaking up the spilled champagne and then back at his smug face. Richard believed he was kicking me out, but he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I turned on my heel and left the murmuring crowd behind me. I did not run. I walked with the measured pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going. I entered the house through the French doors, bypassing the living room where the staff was frozen in awkward silence, and headed straight for my private study. This room was my sanctuary, lined with mahogany bookshelves and soundproofed against the world. I locked the heavy oak door, sat behind my desk, and picked up the secure landline. I dialed a number I knew by heart. Arthur answered on the first ring. He is 70 years old, a forensic accountant who has served my family since before I was born. He is a man who finds more truth in a ledger than a priest finds in a confessional. I did not need to explain what had just happened. Arthur always knew. I asked him if the file on Project Sierra was ready. His voice was gravelly and devoid of surprise when he confirmed that it was not only ready, but contained data that would make a seasoned tax auditor blush. He sent the encrypted file to my private server while we stayed on the line. As the download bar crept across my screen, I allowed myself a brief moment of bitter reflection. For 10 years, I had played a carefully curated role. I am independently wealthy, the sole beneficiary of the Sterling Trust, a fortune built on shipping and real estate that predates the Titanic. Richard, however, needed to feel like the provider. It was crucial for his fragile masculinity. So, I let him pay for dinners. I let him handle the utility bills. I let him believe his struggling tech startup was the engine keeping our life running, while my trust quietly handled the capital gains taxes and the maintenance of our properties. I dimmed my light so he could feel like the sun. But 6 months ago, the sun began to act erratically. It started with urgent business trips to Miami and Los Angeles, locations where his company had no clients. Then came the unexplained cash withdrawals. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. His attitude shifted from affectionate to dismissive, then to outright contempt. He stopped asking about my day and started criticizing my appearance, my friends, and my lack of ambition. The file opened on my screen. The first thing I saw was the analysis of our joint savings account. Richard had drained it. He had siphoned off nearly $200,000 in 6 months. He had purchased Cartier bracelets, first-class flights, and 5-star hotel suites. He was investing in Sierra, trying to buy his way into her world. Then I clicked on the tab labeled Sierra Vance Financial Profile. Arthur is a genius. He had traced the money. Sierra was not a businesswoman. The graph Arthur had created looked less like a corporate structure and more like a parasitic organism. Sierra Vance was a professional romance scammer. She had no company, no assets, and no organic cosmetics line. She had curated an Instagram life of private jets and galas, presenting herself as a bored heiress looking for an equal partner. In reality, she was drowning in credit card debt and had a credit score that would struggle to secure a car loan. She hunted men like Richard, men with just enough money to be useful and enough ego to be blind. She convinced them she was wealthy so they would spend lavishly to keep up with her. It was a psychological long con. Richard was not her boyfriend. He was her latest mark. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when I looked at the text messages Arthur had recovered. Richard had sent her photos of this house. My house. He promised her that once he evicted the squatter, meaning me, the deed would be theirs. He genuinely believed that because he slept here, he owned it. He had no idea that the house was held in a trust established 20 years before I met him. He was trying to steal my ancestral home to pay the entrance fee for a relationship with a woman who was currently bankrupting him. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. There would be no screaming match. There would be no tearful confrontation where I asked him why I was not enough. This was no longer a marriage. It was a business transaction that had gone sour. I did not need a divorce lawyer to hurt him. I needed a calculator. I told Arthur to prepare the final presentation. We were going to fight this war with balance sheets and bank statements. I studied the dossier Arthur had compiled on Sierra Vance. On the surface, she was the perfect modern success story. She claimed to be the founder and CEO of a boutique organic skincare line that was supposedly disrupting the market. Her social media feed was a curated gallery of limited edition designer handbags, steering wheels of German sports cars, and check-ins at exclusive airport lounges. To a man like Richard, who was desperate for validation, She was the ultimate trophy. She had convinced him that she did not need his money, which paradoxically made him want to spend it on her even more. He believed she fell for his intellect and his potential, seeing the genius that I had apparently failed to appreciate. However, Arthur's forensic lens stripped away the glamour to reveal the rot underneath. The Porsche she drove to their dates was not hers. It was a long-term rental paid for by a third party. The Hermes Birkin bag she flaunted in every second photograph was a high-end counterfeit, a super fake sourced from a supplier overseas. But the most damning revelation concerned her living situation. Sierra lived in a sprawling penthouse in Tribeca, a property that costs $15,000 a month to rent. Richard certainly was not paying for that, and neither was her non-existent skincare company. Arthur had uncovered a sophisticated operation that I could only describe as a romance Ponzi scheme. Sierra was not just cheating with Richard, she was crowdfunding her existence. She was juggling multiple relationships simultaneously, assigning each man a specific financial utility based on his net worth and liquidity. It was a cold, hard business model disguised as passion. The breakdown was humiliating for Richard. There was a clear hierarchy to her victims, and my husband was nowhere near the top. We identified a retired baseball player named Marcus who was unknowingly paying the rent on her penthouse, believing it was a family inheritance she was fighting to keep. There was a prominent plastic surgeon named Julian who covered her lavish wardrobe and what she called business trips to Europe. Then there was Thomas, the owner of a high-end chain of steakhouses, who had provided the seed capital for her imaginary cosmetics brand. And then there was Richard. According to the transaction logs, Richard was the entertainment fund. He paid for the expensive dinners, the bottles of vintage wine at clubs, and the daily incidental expenses. He was the gap filler. He was the petty cash she dipped into when she needed a quick dopamine hit of adoration, or a filler for a Tuesday night when the bigger investors were busy. It was both disgusting and darkly hilarious. Richard was destroying our marriage and bankrupting himself to be a minor shareholder in a woman who was publicly traded. I realized then that simply exposing Richard was not enough. If I only showed him the truth, he might deny it or claim I was manufacturing evidence out of jealousy. To truly destroy the fantasy, I needed to dismantle the entire infrastructure of lies Sierra had built. I needed to bring the shareholders together for an emergency board meeting. Arthur had already found the contact information for the other 3 men. They were all listed in Sierra's phone records under affectionate code names, but their bank transfers revealed their true identities. I looked at their profiles. They were successful, prideful men, just like Richard. They would not take kindly to being played for fools. I decided to orchestrate a gathering. I would not invite them to a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation. I would invite them to a comparative financial review. I picked up the phone to dial the first number, ready to invite the plastic surgeon to a very exclusive viewing of the truth. I moved with the precision of a military strategist executing a covert operation. My first move was to secure the attendance of the other victims. I contacted Julian, the plastic surgeon, by leaving a message with his receptionist that I had sensitive information regarding his investments with Miss Vance, and that I would hate for his wife to misunderstand the nature of his financial portfolio. He called back within 5 minutes. For Thomas, the restaurant mogul, and Marcus, the retired baseball legend, the approach was more direct. I sent them digital copies of their own bank transfers to Sierra's account with a simple note that read, "I know where the money went, and it was not for a business venture." 24 hours later, the 3 men sat around the heavy oak table in Arthur's private conference room. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the scent of expensive cologne. They eyed each other with suspicion. 3 alpha males who were used to being the most important person in the room, now forced to share space in a situation they did not control. Julian looked nervous, constantly checking his watch. Thomas looked ready for a fight, his jaw set tight. Marcus just looked confused, slouching in his chair with a baseball cap pulled low. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I stood at the head of the table while Arthur distributed the dossiers. I told them that we were all victims of the same predator, but unlike them, I was not sleeping with her. I was divorcing the man who was. Arthur dimmed the lights and projected a timeline onto the wall. It was a masterclass in forensic accounting. We overlaid Sierra's social calendar with the bank statements of every man in the room. The room fell silent as the colored lines on the chart intersected. I pointed to a weekend in mid-July. I asked Julian if he remembered financing Sierra's charity mission to build schools in Cabo. He nodded, his face paling. I then clicked a button to reveal the GPS data from Richard's phone and the credit card receipts from that same weekend. Sierra had indeed gone to Cabo, but there was no charity. She had spent the weekend at a luxury resort with my husband, Richard. Julian had paid for the first-class flights and the private villa, while Richard had merely paid for the room service and the rental car. Next, we addressed Thomas. He had wired $100,000 to Sierra for what he believed was a seed round for her organic cosmetics line. Arthur pulled up the transaction history. The money had hit Sierra's account on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had been transferred directly to an offshore gambling site to settle a significant debt. There was no company, no product, and certainly no equity. Thomas slammed his fist onto the table, cursing under his breath. Then came the blow for Marcus. The baseball star had been under the impression that he was helping Sierra fight a legal battle to keep her grandmother's penthouse, a property she claimed was her inheritance. He had been paying $15,000 a month for rent. Arthur displayed the property deed. It was owned by a holding company, and Sierra was simply a tenant on a standard lease. Marcus had not been saving a family legacy. He had just been paying her landlord. But the most brutal revelation was reserved for the end. The men realized that while they were being drained of hundreds of thousands of dollars, there was a fourth man involved, Richard. When they looked at Richard's contributions, the room shifted from anger to disbelief. Richard paid for Uber rides. He paid for takeout dinners on Tuesday nights. He bought flowers from the grocery store. Compared to the heavy financial lifting the other three were doing, Richard was essentially a discount boyfriend. He was the filler she used when the high rollers were busy with their actual lives. The realization that my husband was the poorest and most pathetic pawn in her game was a strange vindication. The three men looked at the data, and their competitive nature took over. They were furious not just at the theft, but at the insult of being part of a rotation that included a broke, delusional man like Richard. I proposed a partnership. I told them that tomorrow. Sierra was moving into my home, believing she had won the jackpot. I invited them to be there. I did not want a brawl. I wanted a systematic dismantling of her life, executed with the same cold precision she had used on them. They agreed immediately. The desire for vengeance was the only thing stronger than their embarrassment. As the men left the office, shaking hands with a grim determination, I turned to Arthur. He was already at his computer, opening a new file. I told him to make sure the fonts were large and legible. He began preparing a PowerPoint presentation titled Sierra Vance, a Consolidated Financial Review, designed to be projected on the wall of my living room the moment she walked through the door. The trap was set, and it was going to be spectacular. I sat in the velvet armchair near the window, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, watching my husband dismantle his own life with the enthusiasm of a toddler destroying a block tower. Richard was frantic, barking orders at Mrs. Higgins, a woman who had been the housekeeper for my family since I was in high school. He was demanding she pack my belongings into cardboard boxes he had hastily bought from a hardware store. Mrs. Higgins would cast me worried glances, her hands trembling as she folded my silk scarves, but I would simply offer her a serene smile and a subtle nod. I wanted him to feel in complete control. Richard was pacing the hardwood floor, his phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. He was updating Sierra on his progress, his voice dripping with a nauseating mixture of bravado and submission. He told her that he had cleaned house, that the negative energy was being boxed up, and that the villa was finally ready for her arrival. He referred to my departure as an exorcism. I took a slow sip of tea and pointed to a stack of old magazines on the coffee table. I told him they were rare architectural journals worth thousands and that he should be careful. He immediately snatched them up and packed them with reverence, completely unaware that they were destined for the recycling bin next Tuesday. It was a small, petty joy to watch him treat trash like treasure while treating his wife like garbage. He hung up the phone and turned his sneer toward me. He asked me why I was not crying yet. He told me that looking at me was like looking at a statue, cold and lifeless. He compared me to Sierra, describing her as a force of nature, a woman of wealth and taste who understood the modern world. He mocked my career, my clothes, and my quiet demeanor, claiming that Sierra's vibrancy made him feel alive for the first time in years. He said he needed a partner who was his equal in business and status, not a trust fund baby who played with paintings all day. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. Then, in a moment of supreme arrogance, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a black velvet box. He snapped it open to reveal a ring that was aggressively large. He told me it was a 5-carat diamond. Flawless, just like his new love. He proudly announced that he had liquidated his entire 401k and his private investment portfolio to buy it. He wanted Sierra to have the best the moment she walked through the door. I looked at the stone. It caught the light with a fire that was too colorful, too dispersive. I did not need a loupe to know what it was. Arthur had already flagged the transaction. Sierra had directed Richard to a specific private jeweler, a man she had known for years. Richard had paid nearly $80,000 for that ring, believing it was a wholesale steal. In reality, it was moissanite, a synthetic stone worth a few $100s at most. Sierra and the jeweler had likely already split the difference. Richard had bankrupted his future to buy a piece of glass for a woman who was robbing him blind. I said nothing. I simply told him it was very shiny. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was a text from Arthur. The message was short. Everything is in position. The special guests are turning into the driveway. Richard checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing back his hair. He looked like a man about to win a lottery he did not know was rigged. He heard the sound of a heavy engine approaching the front gate and grinned. He told me to stay out of sight until he called for me, as he did not want my depressing presence to ruin Sierra's grand entrance. He rushed to the front door, practically vibrating with excitement. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt. I feigned a look of nervous apprehension for his benefit. But inside, my heart was beating with the steady, calm rhythm of a judge about to deliver a verdict. I walked toward the foyer, ready to watch the collision. The arrival of the new mistress was a spectacle that defied all logic. A large, beat-up rental moving truck rumbled up the cobblestone driveway, its brakes screeching as it came to a halt in front of the fountain. But the person who stepped out of the passenger side was not dressed for heavy lifting. Sierra Vance emerged looking like she was stepping onto a red carpet at a film premiere. She wore a floor-length crimson gown with a slit that went up to her thigh and 6-inch gold stiletto heels that immediately sank into the gravel. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky and carried a tiny, trembling dog in one arm. It was a performance of wealth so overblown it felt like a parody. She did not wait to be invited in. She marched up the front steps, the heels clicking rhythmically, with an air of absolute ownership. Richard was right behind her, scrambling to open the heavy oak doors, acting more like a doorman than the master of the house. As Sierra stepped into the grand foyer, she did not look at the architecture or the history. She looked at the space with a sneer of disdain. She pointed a manicured finger at the antique crystal chandelier that had hung there for 80 years and announced that it looked like something from a haunted house. She told Richard they would need to gut the entire entrance hall. She wanted to knock down the load-bearing walls to create an open concept flow and paint everything a stark, clinical white. Richard followed her like a servant, nodding enthusiastically at every insult she hurled at our home. He looked pathetic. He was carrying her designer purse, the fake Hermes, awkwardly on his shoulder while he tried to show her the sweep of the staircase. He told her that she had carte blanche to do whatever she wanted. He said that the house finally needed a woman with modern taste to rescue it from the past. He was so desperate to please her that he was agreeing to destroy the very estate he thought he had just conquered. Sierra finally turned her attention to me. I was standing by the archway to the living room, watching them. She walked over to me, the sound of her heels echoing on the marble. She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that was meant to look comforting but felt cold and predatory. She tilted her head and spoke to me in a voice dripping with false sympathy. She told me that she knew this must be hard for me, but it was for the best. She suggested that I should look for a small apartment in the city, perhaps a studio that would be easier for me to manage at my age. She said that a woman in my position should learn to live within her means and that I would be happier without the burden of such a large property. I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked at her and smiled. It was a polite, professional smile, the kind I used when telling a client their masterpiece was a worthless forgery. I told her that I appreciated her concern. I said that before I left the premises. There were just a few standard procedures we needed to clear up regarding the asset handover. I mentioned that my accountant was present to ensure the transition of the deed was legally compliant. For a split second, a shadow of worry crossed Sierra's face. Her eyes darted to Richard, looking for reassurance. Richard laughed, a loud, nervous sound. He told her to ignore me, claiming that I was just trying to be difficult and drag out the inevitable with red tape. He promised her that everything was handled. Sierra relaxed instantly, her arrogance returning in full force. She waved her hand dismissively and said we should get it over with quickly because she had an interior designer coming in an hour. At that moment, the double doors to the library opened. Arthur stepped out. He was not alone. Two of his junior associates walked behind him, dressed in sharp charcoal suits, carrying heavy briefcases and a portable projector screen. They moved with the solemn efficiency of an execution squad. They marched past Sierra without a word and began setting up the equipment in the center of the living room, blocking her view of the garden she planned to pave over. Sierra looked confused. She took a step back, clutching her dog tighter. She asked Richard why there were so many people here. She demanded to know why we needed a projector for a simple move-out. She turned to Richard and reminded him that he had said this house was his and that I was leaving immediately. Her voice was rising, losing its polished composure. Arthur did not answer her. He calmly placed his laptop on the coffee table and connected the HDMI cable. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright blue light onto the screen. I walked past Richard, who was staring at the legal team with his mouth slightly open. I sat down in the high-backed velvet armchair at the head of the room, the seat my father used to occupy. I crossed my legs and rested my hands on the armrests. I looked at the two of them, standing there in their mismatched outfits, the fake billionaire and the broke husband. I told them to sit down because the show was about to start. Arthur stood next to the projection screen with the posture of a university professor about to deliver a failing grade. He pressed a button on his remote control, and the first slide clicked into place with a sharp snap that seemed to echo in the silence of the room. The background was stark white, and the text was black, bold, and unforgiving. The title read, Forensic Cash Flow Analysis and Asset Origin. Below that, it listed the subject of the investigation. It did not say Sierra Vance, the glamorous entrepreneur. It listed her legal birth name, Sarah Jane Vance, followed by her current address, her date of birth, and her full social security number. The color drained from Sierra's face so fast it looked like a physical blow. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw her private government identification projected on a 10-foot screen in my living room. She made a move to stand up, but her knees seemed to buckle, and she sank back onto the sofa. She knew in that instant that her curated persona had just been stripped away. She was not a mysterious heiress. She was a woman with a paper trail, and Arthur had found every scrap of it. Arthur cleared his throat and began to speak. He addressed the issue of the house first. He brought up a scanned image of the property deed. He explained calmly that the estate we were sitting in was the sole property of the Sterling Family Trust. an entity established by my grandfather in 1955. He highlighted the clause regarding ownership. The trust was irrevocable, and I was the sole lifetime beneficiary. The house could not be sold, transferred, or claimed as marital property. Richard had absolutely no legal claim to the roof over his head, let alone the authority to evict me from it. Richard looked like he had been slapped. He stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. He tried to argue, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. He claimed that he had been paying the mortgage for 10 years. He shouted that his money was in these walls. Arthur did not argue. He simply clicked to the next slide. It was a spreadsheet comparing household expenses. Arthur pointed out that the house had been mortgage-free since 1990. There was no mortgage to pay. He then zoomed in on the column labeled Richard's contributions. It showed that for the last decade, Richard's financial input had been limited strictly to the monthly electricity bill and the cable subscription. He had not been paying for the house. He had been paying to keep the lights on while he lived there rent-free. Richard slumped in his chair. The wind completely knocked out of his sails. But Arthur was not done. He clicked the remote again, and the screen changed. This time, it displayed a large, multicolored pie chart titled Income Sources of Sierra Vance. The chart was divided into 4 unequal sections, each represented by a different bright color. Arthur raised a laser pointer and aimed the red dot at the largest section of the chart, a massive red slice that took up 60% of the circle. He explained that this portion of Sierra's income came from a Mr. Marcus, a retired professional athlete. This money, totaling nearly $18,000 a month, was allocated strictly for the rent of the Tribeca penthouse and the lease payments on the luxury SUV parked outside. He moved the laser to the green section, which accounted for 20% of the total. He identified the source as Dr. Julian, a plastic surgeon. This revenue stream covered the costs of international travel, 5-star hotels, and the rotation of designer handbags Sierra used to signal her status. Next was the yellow slice, representing 15%. This money came from Mr. Thomas, a restaurateur. Arthur labeled this as fraudulent investment capital, money that Sierra claimed was for her business, but was immediately diverted to pay off personal debts and gambling losses. Finally, Arthur moved the laser to the tiny, pathetic sliver of blue remaining on the chart. It was barely visible compared to the others, representing a meager 5% of the whole. He looked directly at Richard. He said that this was him. He explained that Richard's financial contribution to the Sierra Vance enterprise was statistically insignificant. The money Richard had stolen from our savings, the money he thought was changing her life, was merely used for incidentals. Richard paid for Uber rides, takeout dinners, and dry cleaning. He was not her savior. He was her petty cash fund. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Richard stared at the screen, realizing he was not the main character in her life. He was an extra who paid for his own costume. His eyes locked on the tiny blue sliver that represented his contribution to Sierra's life. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the projector fan. He looked like a man who had woken up from a long coma only to find out he had been the punchline of a joke the entire time he was asleep. He tried to speak, to form a question, but his voice failed him. The reality that he was not the wealthy provider, but merely the backup plan for a rainy Tuesday, was too much for his ego to process. Sierra, however, recovered her voice first. She leaped to her feet, her face twisted into a mask of fury that cracked her foundation makeup. She screamed that this was all a fabrication, a digital manipulation designed to slander a successful woman. She pointed a shaking finger at Arthur, threatening to sue him for defamation and invasion of privacy. She grabbed her purse and turned toward the exit, declaring that she would not spend another second in this toxic environment. She moved toward the hallway, her heels clacking aggressively on the floor, convinced she could simply walk away from the wreckage. She did not get far. The heavy double doors to the living room swung open with a dramatic weight. 3 men walked in, flanked by a phalanx of grim-faced lawyers in dark suits. The air in the room shifted instantly from tense to explosive. Sierra stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open as she recognized the faces of the men she had been juggling. Julian, the plastic surgeon, was the first to speak. He did not shout. He walked straight to the coffee table where Richard was sitting and threw a stack of glossy photographs onto the surface. They slid across the polished wood, coming to rest right under Richard's nose. They were selfies Sierra had taken, wearing a white bikini on a yacht. Richard looked up, confusion in his eyes, because he had received the exact same photo 3 weeks ago with the caption, "Wishing you were here." Julian told the room that he had paid for the yacht rental in the Mediterranean, believing he was taking his fiancée on a pre-honeymoon trip. Sierra had told Richard she was at a spiritual retreat in Sedona. Marcus, the baseball legend, was less theatrical but far more intimidating. He towered over the room, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway. He walked up to Sierra, who was now trembling visibly. He did not ask for an explanation. He simply held out a large hand, palm up. He told her to give him the keys to the Porsche immediately. He informed her that since his name was on the lease and his bank account paid the monthly premium, he would be taking his property back. He added that he had already called the police to report the vehicle as misappropriated if she did not hand over the fob within 10 seconds. Thomas, the restaurateur, stood by the door, his arms crossed. He spoke with the cold precision of a man who fires people for a living. He announced that his legal team had just filed a civil suit for fraud and embezzlement regarding the $100,000 he had invested in her phantom company. He told Sierra that her accounts had been frozen as of 10 minutes ago. Richard stood up slowly, looking around the circle of men. He was surrounded by genuine wealth, by men who had actually achieved the status he pretended to have, and in the middle of them, he was the smallest, the poorest, and the most foolish. He looked at Sierra, his eyes pleading for her to tell him it was a misunderstanding, that their love was the one true thing in this mess. Sierra looked at Richard, and her face contorted with pure disgust. With her exit blocked and her lies exposed, she needed a target for her rage, and Richard was the easiest victim. She turned on him with the ferocity of a cornered animal. She laughed in his face, a harsh, grating sound. She screamed that he was the most useless man she had ever met. She shouted that he was cheap, boring, and bad in bed. She told him that the only reason she kept him around was that he was desperate enough to run her errands and buy her dinner when the real men were busy. She called him a pathetic little man who had to steal from his wife just to buy her a fake ring. Richard recoiled as if she had physically struck him. The illusion of his grand romance evaporated, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his marriage with absolutely nothing to show for it. I sat in my armchair, taking a slow sip of my tea. I watched the chaos unfold with a feeling of deep, cold satisfaction. I did not have to scream. I did not have to fight. I did not even have to throw him out. I simply turned on the lights, and the cockroaches began to tear each other apart. The chaos in the living room was interrupted by the sharp, authoritative knock of the Economic Crimes Unit. Arthur had not just invited the victims, he had forwarded his entire investigation to the authorities hours ago. The officers did not need to ask many questions. They had the bank records, the fraudulent wire transfers, and, thanks to Arthur's deep dive, an outstanding warrant for Sierra's arrest regarding an insurance scam in Nevada 3 years ago. The sight of Sierra being handcuffed in her red gown, still clutching her fake Hermes bag, was a grim finale to her performance. She was marched out the door, shouting obscenities at the men she had swindled, leaving a silence in her wake that was heavy with embarrassment. Richard stood alone in the center of the room. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for was gone, and he was left facing the wife he had tried to humiliate. The arrogance that had fueled him 24 hours ago evaporated. He dropped to his knees on the Persian rug, reaching out for my hand. He was crying, ugly, desperate sobs. He told me he had been bewitched, that she had manipulated him, and that he still loved me. He begged for a second chance, swearing he would make it right. I did not pull my hand away because I did not let him touch me. I simply reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick document. I tossed it onto the floor in front of him. It was a new divorce petition. The terms were significantly different from the ones he had thrown at me the night before. There was no alimony. There was no division of assets. There was a clause demanding repayment of the marital funds he had embezzled. Arthur stepped forward to deliver the final blow. He informed Richard that the board of directors at his startup had been notified of the unauthorized withdrawals from the corporate expense account to fund Sierra's lifestyle. It did not matter that the amounts were small compared to the other men. Theft was theft. A vote had been taken an hour ago. Richard was removed as CEO, effective immediately, and the company legal team was already drafting a lawsuit to recover the funds. I checked my watch, mirroring the gesture he had made at the party. I told him he had exactly 30 minutes to pack his personal effects and leave the property. I reminded him that he had given me 36 hours, but I was not feeling as generous. The 3 other men, Julian, Marcus, and Thomas, lined up to shake my hand. There was no misogyny in their eyes now, only a profound respect for the woman who had saved them from financial ruin. They thanked me for the wake-up call and left, their lawyers trailing behind them. Richard scrambled to the guest room, throwing his clothes into 2 suitcases. He emerged 29 minutes later, looking aged and defeated. He walked out the front door, the same door he had held open for Sierra less than an hour ago. Outside, the sky had finally broken open, and a cold rain was falling. I stood at the large bay window in the library, holding a fresh cup of tea. I watched my husband drag his luggage down the long driveway, a solitary figure with no home, no job, and no mistress. For the first time in 6 months, the house was quiet, and I felt a lightness in my chest that I had not felt in years. 1 month later, the silence in my art appraisal office was not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet hum of absolute power. I sat behind my desk, reviewing the final acquisition papers when Arthur walked in. He carried a single, thin folder, a stark contrast to the heavy boxes of evidence he had wielded during the eviction. He placed it gently on the glass surface of my desk. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the secret I had kept even from Richard during our entire marriage. He had always assumed my family wealth was tied up in dusty real estate and old paintings. He never knew that the Sterling Family Trust was an aggressive, diversified entity, or that we were the silent majority shareholders in the venture capital firm that had funded his startup. Technically, I had owned a piece of his company since the day he founded it. I had watched him struggle, and I had let my trust inject capital anonymously to keep him afloat, protecting his ego. But now, the dynamic had changed. With the lawsuits from the board piling up and his personal debts from the Sierra debacle mounting, Richard was desperate for liquidity. He had put his remaining equity up for sale at a fire sale price, hoping some anonymous investor would save him. He did not know the buyer was me. I signed the document, authorizing the transfer of funds. I did not let the company go bankrupt. That would have been a waste of a good investment. Instead, I bought him out completely. I acquired his life's work for pennies on the dollar, securing a controlling interest. I was no longer just his ex-wife. I was his boss. An hour later, I walked into the main conference room of the tech company. Richard was there, clearing out his personal office. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant shine in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull resignation. When he saw me, he stopped packing. He looked at the new organizational chart on the wall, where my name was listed as the chairperson of the board. He asked me why I had to be so cruel. He asked if taking the house and his dignity wasn't enough. He wanted to know why I had to take the one thing he had built himself. I walked over to the head of the table and ran my hand along the leather chair. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the truth. I told him that he had thrown divorce papers in my face to impress a woman who saw him as a bank account. I told him that I bought his company to impress myself. I needed to remind him and the world that I was never just a spectator in his success. I was the foundation. Richard left the building without another word, carrying a cardboard box containing a stapler and a framed photo of a dog he no longer owned. I watched him go, feeling a profound sense of closure. The cycle was complete. That weekend, the lights at the Hamptons estate blazed to life once more. I re-hosted the fundraiser that Richard had so rudely interrupted. The same guests were there, but the atmosphere was different. The whispers were gone, replaced by looks of admiration and respect. I wore a dress that cost more than Richard's new car, and I stood at the center of the room, not as a victim, but as a victor. I raised a crystal flute of champagne to make a toast. I did not toast to revenge or to the past. I looked over at Arthur, who was standing by the buffet table, looking pleased with himself. I raised my glass to competence. I realized I did not need a man to define my value or secure my future. I just needed a sharp mind, a steel spine, and a forensic accountant who knew where the bodies were buried. Later that night, in the quiet of my study, I wrote a check to Arthur. It was a bonus, a figure so substantial it would allow him to retire immediately, though I knew he never would. I signed my name with a flourish, sat back in my grandfather's chair, and smiled. The future was bright. Solvency was beautiful, and living well was truly the best revenge. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on Victoria's revenge. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more listeners.